Good morning. Happy Advent. Is that a phrase? There really aren't any good Advent greetings. It feels like Christmas took all the good ones. Anyways, my name's Taylor, and I'm glad to be with you this morning as we start off our new sermon series, Advent, the gifts we really want. And since we're now officially post-Thanksgiving and Mariah Carey has emerged from her 11-month-long non-Christmas time of the year hibernation, I feel like it's now in bounds to ask you a Christmas question. How many of you have a Christmas tradition which involves watching the same Christmas movie, or maybe movies plural, like every year? Our family certainly does. I grew up on the Patrick Stewart version of A Christmas Carol, although I'll admit I'm actually a little bit more partial to the Muppet version. We love Elf and Home Alone too. Chevy Chase's Christmas Vacation is a great one. And of course, no Christmas would be complete without my favorite Christmas movie, Die Hard. Now, all of these are unique stories, but they all have something in common. You know what it is? They're all happy stories. They all have a happily ever after where everything works out, which, it makes sense because most of us prefer happy endings to stories, especially at Christmas time. Happiness sells. A few years ago, I was at a Christmas party and someone asked the same question that I just asked you about, our favorite Christmas movies. And one person there said that they watch It's a Wonderful Life every year, which seemed to surprise literally everyone else there. And the reason for everyone else's surprise is that the movie's so sad. Yeah, it ends well, but boy, they really make you work for it. This is a time of year for cheer and rejoicing. It's a time of giving gifts and being merry. Joy is literally one of the 4 weeks of Advent after all. And isn't joy basically the same thing as happiness? Well, as it happens, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. The reason we've named this series The Gifts We Really Want is that so often the gifts we get this time of year, well, they aren't the things we truly want. Tube socks, again. Wow, how sweet. We often think that we want happiness, but the gift that we really truly long for is joy. Yet much of the church and the wider world often has a hard time distinguishing between the two, so much so that they're often even misused as synonyms for each other. That's certainly been my experience. This Sunday of Advent used to be one of my least favorite Sundays of the year. Now, I know that sounds a bit strange, but the reason was that in the church I grew up at, joy and happiness, well, they might as well have been synonyms. If you weren't happy, well, then you weren't joyful. And if you weren't joyful, well, then something was wrong with you. The Bible clearly says, always be joyful. Most children, when they're born, are referred to as a bundle of joy. My family apparently referred to me as a little old man. Now, I wouldn't come to understand this about myself until I was in my early 20s, but as it turns out, I had undiagnosed depression and anxiety, at least as far back as my early teens. I had spent a decade hearing people in church telling me to smile more. I received a lot of underhanded comments about the apparent deficit in my faith because of my lack of happiness. Now, it certainly doesn't help matters that I have a pretty serious case of RBF. In fact, to this day, it's pretty common, by which I mean it happens to me a few times a month, where someone will follow up with me a day or two after a meeting and ask if I was upset. No, that's just what my face looks like. But growing up, I really did struggle to feel much by way of positive or pleasant emotions before I got diagnosed and treated. And that made church a minefield. I really did start to believe that something was wrong with my faith. And in fairness, it did seem like everyone else was happier than me. And honestly, most people probably were happier than me. That wasn't a high bar to clear. And it felt like because happiness was out of reach, that joy was off the table. And because joy wasn't available to me, my faith was second rate, or worse, counterfeit. So on the Sunday in Advent, every year where joy is the whole focus of the service, I came to dread that day. I got good at faking it, or at the very least, trying to go unnoticed. And of course, that only makes the problem worse, because being isolated while being in a community where you can't be honest is stifling. I'm wondering if maybe you've ever felt this way. If the Christmas time blitz of let's all be happy has felt less invitational and more oppressive. Or maybe you've experienced joy and happiness being conflated. And then when you're feeling down, you're starting to wonder if something is wrong with your faith. Or if, like me, you do want to feel happier, it's just that the things you try, they don't seem to work or to last. Well, if that's you, I'm going to let you in on a little secret. You're not alone. Everyone wants to feel happier. Life is so full of things that wear us down and make us weary. It really wouldn't take much for me to pull all the oxygen out of the room. All I'd have to do is open a news app on my phone and read a few headlines, and we'd all quickly be reminded of how lacking in happiness the world we live in is. And that's to say nothing about our personal lives, the stresses of family, work, or school. Take your pick. There's more than enough options out there for all of us to be saying, yeah, I could use some more happiness in my life right about now. And you know what? Lots of companies, they know it. And so they promise to sell us all the solutions. Feeling down about aging? There's a cream you can buy for that. Feeling worried or anxious? Here's another influencer reel to distract you while you don't think about it. Feeling sad? How about a new outfit? Want to pick me up? Have you tried getting a new iPhone therapy? Lonely? Feeling like there's a hole inside of you? You know what else has a hole inside of it? Donuts. How about a dozen? Look, life is hard, so why not treat yourself? The thing about all these solutions is that they do work for a little bit. They do offer some temporary relief, but that fleeting feeling of happiness always fades so much faster than we want. And so we go back for another top off of whatever our preferred method of relief is. We all have one. And the reason it doesn't last is because the gift we truly long for isn't happiness. It's joy. And joy isn't for sale. It can't be bought or sold, no matter how much advertisers try to convince us otherwise. Yet, of course, that doesn't stop us from trying. And the insidious thing about many of these solutions, these attempts to manage the symptoms without addressing the root cause, is that all we're really doing is temporarily numbing or masking our pain. And that creates a pattern of dependency. The more we go to our balm of choice, the less it works, and the more we need it, and then less and less it works, and the more and more we need it. In neurological terms, this is what happens when reward pathways are overstimulated with dopamine and therefore become less sensitive and require more and more to achieve the same effect. It's a descending spiral that feels good at first, but ultimately makes the problem worse. And we're just left feeling emptier and less joyful than when we started. The core issue here is that we often settle for happiness when the thing that we truly long for is joy. Happiness is an emotion, and emotions, as pleasant and wonderful as they can be, are often very temporary and heavily influenced by our environment. We often have very little control over what we feel at any given moment. It's why we go to such great lengths to change our environment or our inputs, to change our feelings. In fact, that dynamic right there could probably describe the motivation for the vast majority of all human behavior. But joy, on the other hand, that's something entirely different. Joy is what we might call, in psychological terms, a supra-emotion, because it certainly can have an emotive quality to it, and it often does. But it also transcends emotion. Joy, unlike emotions, it's not dependent on our circumstances, because the way we access and experience joy is through a relational connection with God. I'm gonna say that one more time. the way we access and experience joy is through a relational connection with God. We were created to connect with God, yet we often try to fill that void of connection with other cheap substitutes. This same dynamic has existed as long as humanity has existed. In the psalm we read for this sermon, David describes a similar pattern in ancient Israel of people who run after other gods and end up suffering more and more. No one goes out in search of suffering intentionally. People who pursue idols do so because they hope that those gods can solve their problems. And in a sense, that's what every idol is. It's an attempt to solve a problem with something that promises an easier fix or solution than whatever it is we're currently trying with God. It's only after we get down that road a little ways that we find out that the solutions offered don't work and ultimately lead to the very suffering we were trying to avoid in the first place. Just like all those quick fix hits that we try ourselves. The reason we pursue other alternatives is because we sense something is missing. Something isn't working in our lives. While we don't know all of the context in which David wrote this psalm, we can infer some of the challenges that he's facing in the community by taking the inverse of his themes. He writes in verse 1, "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take my refuge." And verses 9 and 10, he writes, "My body will also rest secure because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay." I think it's a fair assumption to say that lack of physical safety was probably a real fear whenever David wrote this. There were no shortage of times when that was a problem in David's life. When he faced lions and bears, when he faced Goliath, when Saul was hunting him down, when he was at war countless times. There are other examples too. In verses 2 and 4, he writes, "Apart from you, I have no good thing. And Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure." It sounds like there was probably some reason to have some level of concern about not having enough. Look, I don't know what your personal definition of a good time is, but for my money, whatever David's going through here in this moment doesn't sound like a good time. As the youth would say, the vibes are off. Whatever occasion it was that prompted David to write this psalm, it certainly wasn't brimming with happiness. Yet, David describes himself as being filled with joy in the presence of the Lord. David experienced joy by being relationally connected to God, and that transcended his circumstances. Notice he isn't saying he's happy-go-lucky. He's saying he's joyful. Sure, a quick hit of dopamine would be great in the midst of trials and tribulations. I'm not knocking that. But what David is describing is something far more durable. It's sustaining him into and through some deeply dark times. And frankly, I want that. But how? I've been asking myself a version of this same question since I was a kid. And sometimes it just feels so out of reach. Well, David clearly had two key practices, which you can see traces of in this psalm, that opened up joy in his life. The first one, the first key it's fairly easy to decipher. It's in verses 5 and 6. He writes, "Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance." So that first key was gratitude. Instead of constantly striving for more and peering over our neighbor's shoulders or our neighbor's fence, wondering about the grass in their yard, David is focused on what he does have. And he's actively giving God thanks for what he's been given. He recognizes that all good things that he does have are reason to give God thanks. It's often been said that comparison is the thief of joy, and that couldn't be truer. The truth is, the grass is greenest where we water it. This psalm is a prayer, and that may sound like a trivial detail, but I personally find that very convicting. It's like, I don't know about you, but most of my prayers, they don't sound like this. They sound like me writing a list to Santa of all the things I want God to do for me. If my prayers were written out, they would read more like a complaint to customer service. David is praying through his gratitude to God, and that practice helps him cultivate and helps him sustain joy. Now, the second key to David's joy, it's a little harder to decipher, and the reason for that is that it's sort of buried in the Hebrew. There's this truth that's just woven throughout the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, that unfortunately, because it's hard to translate the idioms, often it doesn't really come across quite clearly in English translations. In verse 8, which reads, I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. That phrase in there, I keep my eyes on the Lord, more literally translated would be, I keep my eyes in front of God's sight. In other words, David is talking about making eye contact with God. He's talking about looking at the face of God and seeing and experiencing the joy of being seen by God. Earlier I mentioned two definitions of joy. One was the more psychological, which is that joy is a supra emotion, and the other is a bit more of a classical theological definition, that joy is being relationally connected to God. Well, there's actually another definition of joy I came across recently. It's a neurobiological definition of joy, which stems from a research study done out of UCLA's School of Medicine. And they write that joy is what we experience when we are with someone who is glad to be with us. Or put another way, joy is being the sparkle in someone's eyes. As it turns out, that's actually a deeply biblical definition of joy, because throughout the scriptures and even in the text we read today, joy is deeply connected to seeing the face of God. We see it most obviously in number 6, which we know as the doxology. May the Lord bless you and protect you. May the Lord smile on you and be gracious to you. May the Lord show you his favor and give you his peace. For so many of us, when we picture God, we often picture someone who's disappointed in us, angry with us, ashamed of us. Yet, when God looks at us, God smiles. I don't know why it is that we often lose sight of this. Maybe it's because when we talk about God's love, our minds tend to wander about all the imperfect ways that humans love. Or when we talk about God as a father or as a parent, we often think about the challenging or broken relationships that we have, either as parents or as children, or maybe as both. But I want you to hear this clearly. When God looks at you, you bring a smile to his face. God delights in you. I know that might sound a little sappy, and so if you're feeling a bit cynical or guarded about that, I want to encourage you to let your guard down for a moment and really take that in. God delights in you. God is fond of you. God loves you. God likes you. You bring a smile to God's face. When God thinks about you, he gets a little grin on his face because you make God happy. David knew this. And so he regularly kept his eyes focused on God's face to be reminded that God was with him and delighted in him. I've been working on cultivating more joy in my life recently. Admittedly, it's not been something that I'm very good at naturally. And while it's been a long time, decades since I heard those messages growing up that caused me to feel like there was a deficit within me, sometimes the narratives that we take on when we're young, well, they can stick with us long into adulthood. But lately I've been trying to unwrap that narrative and let God help me write a new one. So I want you to hear that too. If you feel like joy is out of reach for you, I hope you know that's a lie. Joy comes from connection with God, and it is both a gift and a practice that everyone and anyone can cultivate and delight in. There are a few practices that I've been working on to try to cultivate joy in my life on a more regular basis. It started out 6 months ago, actually almost by happenstance. I was in Orlando representing High Rock at our denomination's annual meeting, and my wife Rachel flew down to join me. We'd figured we'd hit up some of the amusement parks while we were there because, well, when in Rome. And of course, you all know the classic saying that Orlando is the Rome of Florida. Well, neither of us had been to an amusement park in over 20 years, and we'd never been together, but we decided, what the heck, we'll give it a shot. I will admit, in the past, I have harbored some judgmental thoughts about people who go to amusement parks on vacation, but secretly, deep down, I really wanted to go to the Star Wars park. If you didn't know this about me already, I'm a mega Star Wars nerd. Now, there's this thing you can do while you're there, which is that you can build your own lightsaber. But of course, I'm too refined, too sophisticated, way too mature for that. Okay, we definitely did it, and it was awesome. Now, on one hand, if that's all it was, then it was just a quick consumeristic experience, then it probably wouldn't have been that memorable. But truly, the most joyful part of the whole experience was that I let myself play, and I really let my nerd flag fly. I'm gonna admit, I was actually a little bit nervous, which doesn't make much sense, but there is something oddly vulnerable about allowing yourself to openly like something, or in this case, love it. And when I turned around after I had finished building my lightsaber, I saw Rachel was smiling at me. She was happy that I was happy. And it was that moment which truly made it so deeply joyful. To see my wife smiling at me while I was vulnerable and delighting in my inner nerddom, it was truly a profoundly beautiful moment of being seen. For me, this was the spark that started this process over the last 6 months of leaning into practicing joy intentionally. It's not something that comes naturally to me, whether it's just my natural affect or it's my penchant for being responsible and serious. I've really had to work at it. And one of the ways we can live into the joyful practice of seeing God's face smiling at us, delighting in us, is by seeing the image of God reflected back at us in the faces of loved ones, friends, sisters, and brothers in Christ. If you've ever taken like a Psych 101 course, you've probably read about still face experiments, which is essentially the opposite of what I'm describing, but it drives home the point of how profoundly important this is. In these research experiments, the mothers of young children, typically around 2 or younger, are instructed not to smile back at their children, to show a completely still face with no emotion or affect. You know what happens? When that happens, children start to get anxious. They often start to cry, to fidget. Their heart rate increases, their cortisol levels go up in their bodies. We are created for connection. There's nothing quite like the feeling of walking into a room and seeing someone you love light up when they see you. That feeling, that sensation, that is joy. That, at a very core foundational level, is what God desires for all of us to experience in all of our relationships. And I know that sounds bananas because most of us would be thrilled to have 2 or even just 1 relationship like that. But that truly is how God desires for us to be connected to Him and to one another. Yet the reality of our broken world is so far from that, which is why the second practice that I've been working on cultivating is remembering joyful moments. Or put another way, is practicing gratitude for the joyful moments that have come before. This practice is more than just making a decision to be grateful, because as nice as that sounds in theory, that's not really going to take us very far. There is an actual practice, and it takes a few moments. You could try this while journaling or praying, or even if you're just telling a story to friends. But taking a few minutes to actively remember a time, a moment, when you felt deeply connected to and loved by God, when you felt seen, when you felt known and accepted, delighted in. Or it could simply be recalling a moment when there was deep joy for another reason. But, and this is key, part of it is remembering how you felt in that moment. Did you get chills? Did you have the warm fuzzies? Did your cheeks hurt a bit because you were smiling so hard? Did you get out of breath from laughing? This is essentially what David was doing when he wrote the psalm we read today. He is actively recalling joyful memories of God's goodness, which connects him to the face of God and helps sustain his joy in the midst of his present challenges. When we do this, when we actively and intentionally recall a joyful experience and we relive it for a few moments in thoughtful gratitude, that enriches the soil of our present moment, and it raises our capacity for joy in the here and now. It retrains and strengthens our spirit's ability to find our way back to God in difficult times by remembering that there is more than just our present circumstances. So I want to give us a chance to actually try this out today. And I recognize that for many of us, this is going to stretch us a bit beyond our typical comfort zone, but that's okay. I believe in you. You can do this. So I want to invite you to take just a few moments. Recall a joyful memory in this moment. Was there a time when you felt relationally close to someone or to God, when joy filled the room, when people were smiling? Whatever memory comes to mind first, it could be from something this week or it could be from 20 years ago. There's no wrong answers. Now, if you're up for it, you don't have to, but if you're up for it, you can close your eyes and picture yourself back in that moment. Can you remember what you felt like? Did that feeling exist somewhere specifically in your body? It's okay if it takes a bit to recall, or if it doesn't come naturally at first. We'll just take a moment, 30 seconds or so. Okay, for those of you who gave it a shot, you can open your eyes. Friends, God is good. God delights in you and wants you to experience the joy of seeing his face shine upon you. I hope that you know that joy is not out of reach for you. Joy is a gift that is for you. So my prayer for all of us in this Advent season is that we would continue to be intentional and thoughtful about cultivating the practices of joy in our lives, that we would all receive the gift that we truly want. Amen.